Hey guys, hoping all is well with everyone. So in this video, we're going to be continuing the read-along of Wayside stories from Wayside School by Louis Sachar. And last time we finished off, we completed chapter 6, so we'll be starting today with chapter 7. And as always, I'll be showing you any pictures as we come across them, but please feel free to follow along. Chapter 7, Calvin. Calvin had a big, round face. "Calvin," said Mrs. Jules, "I want you to take this note to Miss Zarves for me." "Miss Zarves?" asked Calvin. "Yes, Miss Zarves," said Mrs. Jules. "You know where she is, don't you?" "Yes," said Calvin. "She's on the 19th story." "That's right, Calvin," said Mrs. Jules. "Take it to her." Calvin didn't move. "Well, what are you waiting for?" asked Mrs. Jules. "She's on the 19th story," said Calvin. And here's a picture of Calvin. "Yes, we have already established that fact," said Mrs. Jules. "The 19th story," Calvin repeated. "Yes, Calvin, the 19th story," said Mrs. Jules. "Now take it to her before I lose my patience." "But, Mrs. Jules," said Calvin. "Now, Calvin," said Mrs. Jules, "unless you would rather go home on the kindergarten bus." "Yes, ma'am," said Calvin. Slowly he walked out the door. Laughed Terence. "Take it to the 19th story." "Give it to Mrs. Zarves," hooted Myron. "Have fun on the 19th story," called Jason. Calvin stood outside the door to the classroom. He didn't know where to go. As you know, when the builder built Wayside School, he accidentally built it sideways. But he also forgot to build the 19th story. He built the 18th and the 20th, but no 19th. He said he was very sorry. There was also no Miss Zarves. Miss Zarves taught the class on the 19th story. Since there was no 19th story, there was no Miss Zarves. And besides that, as if Calvin didn't have enough problems, there was no note. Mrs. Jules had never given Calvin the note. "Boy, this is just great," thought Calvin. "Just great. I'm supposed to take a note that I don't have to a teacher who doesn't exist, who teaches on a story that was never built." He didn't know what to do. He walked down to the 18th story, then back up to the 20th, then back down to the 18th, then back up again to the 20th. There was no 19th story. There never was a 19th story, and there never will be a 19th story. Calvin walked down to the administration office. He decided to put the note in Mrs. Zarves' mailbox, but there wasn't one of those either. That didn't bother Calvin too much, however, since he didn't have a note. He looked out the window and saw Louis, the yard teacher, shooting baskets. "Louis will know what to do," he thought. Calvin went outside. "Hey, Louis," Calvin called. "Hi, Calvin," said Louis. He tossed him a basketball. Calvin dribbled up and took a shot. He missed. Louis tipped it in. "Do you want to play a game?" Louis asked. "I don't have time," said Calvin. "I have to deliver a note to Miss Zarves up on the 19th story." "Then what are you doing all the way down here?" Louis asked. "There is no 19th story," said Calvin. "Then where is Miss Zarves?" asked Louis. "There is no Miss Zarves," said Calvin. "What are you going to do with the note?" asked Louis. "There is no note," said Calvin. "I understand," said Louis. "That's good," said Calvin, "because I sure don't." "It's very simple," said Louis. "You are not supposed to take no notes to no teachers. You already haven't done that." Calvin still didn't understand. "I'll just have to tell Mrs. Jules that I couldn't deliver the note," he said. "That's good," said Louis. "The truth is always best. Besides, I don't think I understand what I said either." Calvin walked back up the 30 flights of stairs to Mrs. Jules' class. "Thank you very much, Calvin," said Mrs. Jules. Calvin said, "But I—" Mrs. Jules interrupted him. "That was a very important note, and I'm glad I was able to count on you." "Yes, but you see," said Calvin, "you delivered the note to Mrs. Zarves on the 19th story," asked Jason. "How did you do it?" "What do you mean, how did he do it?" asked Mrs. Jules. He gave Mrs. Zarves the note. Some people, Jason, are responsible. But you see, Mrs. Jules, said Calvin. The note was very important, said Mrs. Jules. I told Mrs. Zarves not to meet me for lunch. Don't worry, said Calvin. She won't. Good, said Mrs. Jules. I have a coffee can full of Tootsie Roll Pops on my desk. You may help yourself to one, for being such a good messenger. Thanks, said Calvin, but really, it was nothing. Chapter 8. Myron. Myron had big ears. He was elected class president. The children in Mrs. Jules' class expected him to be a good president. Other presidents were good speakers. Myron was even better. He was a good listener. But he had a problem. He didn't know what a class president was supposed to do. So he asked, What am I supposed to do? It's a difficult job, said Mrs. Jules, but you can do it. You must turn the lights on every morning and turn them off at the end of the day. What? Asked Myron. As a class president, you must learn to listen, said Mrs. Jules. And here's a picture of Myron. As a class president, you must learn to listen, said Mrs. Jules. I'll repeat myself only one more time. You must turn the lights on every morning. I heard you the first time, said Myron. It just doesn't sound like much of a job. It certainly is, said Mrs. Jules. Without light, I can't teach, and the children can't learn. Only you can give us that light. I think it is a very important job. I guess so, said Myron. He wasn't convinced. Here, let me show you how to work a light switch, said Mrs. Jules. I already know how, said Myron. I've been turning lights on and off all my life. Very good, said Mrs. Jules. You'll make a fine president. Myron wanted to be the best president ever, but it was such an easy job, he thought that anybody could do it. When school let out that day, Myron stayed behind. He turned out the lights by flicking the switch down. Excellent, said Mrs. Jules. On his way home, Myron heard a horrible noise. First there was a loud screeching, then a sharp squeal, a roaring engine, and then a very faint sound of a girl crying. Myron ran to see what had happened. Dana was bent over in the middle of the road. What's the matter? Asked Myron. My dog, Pugsy, was hit by a car, Dana cried. Who did it? Asked Myron. I don't know, Dana sobbed. They sped away. Well, that's not important, said Myron. We've got to try to save Pugsy. Pugsy lay unconscious in the street. Myron carefully picked her up. He carried her 2 miles to the vet. Dana cried at his side. Don't worry, Dana, said Myron. She'll be all right. But he wasn't really so sure. He gave Pugsy to the vet, walked Dana home, then walked home himself. Dana was so upset that she forgot to thank him. Myron didn't mind. He thought that that's what being the class president was all about. The next morning, before he went to school, Myron went to Dana's house. Pugsy was there. She seemed all right. Dana petted her. Pugsy licked her face. See, Myron, she's all right, said Dana. The vet said that you brought her in just in time. Hi, Pugsy, said Myron. He petted her. Pugsy bit his hand. I guess she doesn't know you, said Dana. She was unconscious yesterday when you saved her life. Dana's mother put some medicine and a Band-Aid on Myron's hand. Then she drove the children to school. They were late. They ran up the stairs to Mrs. Jules' class. The room was completely dark. It's about time you got here, Myron, said Mrs. Jules. We have no lights. Why didn't somebody else turn them on? Asked Myron. Because you're class president, said Mrs. Jules. Show Stephen how to work the lights. From now on, he will be class president. Myron showed Stephen how to turn on the lights. He flicked the switch up. At the end of the day, Myron showed Stephen how to turn the lights off. He flicked the switch down. After a week, Stephen finally caught on. He made a good president. The lights were on every morning. Myron, who was president for only a day, was the best president in the history of Wayside School. It was just that nobody knew it. Chapter 9. Maurecia. Maurecia liked ice cream. She was sweet and pretty and could beat up any boy in Mrs. Jules' class. Everybody liked Maurecia, except Kathy, but then she didn't like anybody. Maurecia only liked ice cream. Every day, Maurecia brought an ice cream cone to school and kept it in her desk until lunchtime. At first, she brought chocolate ice cream every day, but she soon tired of chocolate ice cream. So she started bringing vanilla, but she got tired of vanilla too. Then she got tired of strawberry, fudge ripple, butter pecan, pistachio, and burgundy cherry in that order. And then a terrible thing happened. Maurecia got tired of ice cream. By that time, her desk was a mess, and everything in it was sticky. Everybody liked Maurecia, but Maurecia didn't like anything. Mrs. Jules hated to see Maurecia unhappy. I don't understand it, Mrs. Jules, cried Maurecia. There just aren't any good flavors anymore. So Mrs. Jules worked all night. The next day she brought in a new flavor of ice cream for Maurecia. It was Maurecia flavored ice cream. Everybody will like it, thought Mrs. Jules, because everybody likes Maurecia. Here you are, Maurecia, said Mrs. Jules. Maurecia flavored ice cream. Everyone gathered around as Maurecia tasted it. They hoped she'd like it. Maurecia took a lick. Well, said Mrs. Jules. Maurecia took another lick. Well, asked the class. This ice cream has no taste, said Maurecia. It doesn't taste bad, but it doesn't taste good. It doesn't taste like anything at all. Mrs. Jules was heartbroken. Here, let me try it, said Todd. He tasted it. You're crazy, Maurecia, he said. This is the best tasting ice cream I've ever eaten. Try some, Dee Dee. Mmm, it's delicious, said Dee Dee. It's so sweet and creamy. She passed it around the room. Oh, it is so good, said Leslie. I think it tastes terrible, said Kathy. I don't understand it, said Maurecia. I don't taste a thing. Mrs. Jules slapped herself in the face. Oh, I've made a terrible and big mistake, Maurecia. Of course you can't taste anything. It's Maurecia flavored ice cream. It's the same taste you always taste when you're not tasting anything at all. So the next day, Mrs. Jules brought in Joe flavored ice cream. Maurecia liked it. So did everyone else. Joe thought it had no taste. Everybody liked Maurecia. Maurecia only liked Joe. The following day, Mrs. Jules brought in Ron flavored ice cream. Ron thought it had no taste, but everyone else loved it. Everybody liked Maurecia. Maurecia only liked Joe and Ron. By the end of the month, Mrs. Jules had brought in 27 new flavors of ice cream, one for each member of the class. Everybody liked Maurecia, and Maurecia liked everybody. They all tasted so good. All except Kathy, that is. Kathy flavored ice cream tasted a little bit like old bologna. Everyone still agreed that Maurecia flavored ice cream was the best, except Maurecia. She liked Todd ice cream the best. This turned out to be a problem. Every once in a while, Maurecia would try to take a bite out of Todd's arm in order to get that very special flavor. Yikes. All right, chapter 10. Paul. Paul had the best seat in Mrs. Jules' class. He sat in the back of the room. It was the seat that was farthest away from Mrs. Jules. Mrs. Jules was teaching the class about fractions. She drew a picture of a pie on the blackboard. She cut the pie into 8 pieces. She explained that each piece was 1/8 of the pie. Paul never paid attention. He didn't see the picture of the pie. He didn't see anything. Well, he did see one thing. Actually, he saw 2 things. He saw Leslie's pigtails. Leslie sat in front of Paul. She had 2 long, brown pigtails that reached all the way down her waist. And here's a picture of Paul. Paul saw those pigtails, and a terrible urge came over him. He wanted to pull a pigtail. He wanted to wrap his fist around it, feel the hair between his fingers, and just yank. He thought it would almost be fun to tie the pigtails together, or better yet, tie them to her chair. But most of all, he just wanted to pull one. Slowly, he reached for one on the right. No! What am I doing? He thought. I'll only get into trouble. Paul had it made. He sat in the back of the room. He paid no attention to anyone, and nobody paid attention to him. But if he pulled a pigtail, it would be all over. Leslie would tell on him, and he'd become the center of attention. He sighed and slowly withdrew his arm. But Paul couldn't ignore those pigtails. There they were, dangling right in front of him, just begging to be pulled. He could close his eyes, but he couldn't make the pigtails disappear. He could still smell them and hear them. He could almost taste them. Maybe just a little tug, he thought. No, none. There they hung, easily within his reach. Well, we'll let them just hang there, thought Paul. It would be foolish to pull one, no matter how tempting they were. None of the other children in class pulled pigtails. Why should he? Of course, none of the other children sat behind Leslie either. It was just a simple matter of being able to think clearly. That was all. Paul thought it over and decided not to pull one. It was as simple as that. Suddenly, his arm shot forward. He grabbed Leslie's right pigtail and yanked. Yeah! Screamed Leslie. Everyone looked at her. Paul pulled my pigtail, she said. They all looked at Paul. I couldn't help it, said Paul. You'd better learn to help it, said Mrs. Jules. She wrote Paul's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Tell Leslie you're sorry. I'm sorry, Leslie, said Paul. Humph, said Leslie. Paul felt horrible. Never again would he pull another pigtail. Except there was one problem. He still wasn't satisfied. He had pulled the right one, but that wasn't enough. He wanted to pull the left one, too. It was as if he heard a little voice coming from the pigtail saying, Pull me, Paul, pull me. I can't, Paul answered. My name's already on the blackboard under the word discipline. Big deal, said the pigtail. Pull me. No way, said Paul. Never again. Oh, come on, Paul. Just a little tug, urged the pigtail. What harm could it do? Lots of harm, said Paul. Leslie will scream, and I'll get into trouble again. Boy, that's not fair, whined the pigtail. You pulled the right one. Now it's my turn. I know, but I can't, said Paul. Sure you can, said the pigtail. Just grab me and yank. No, said Paul. It's not right. Sure it is, Paul, said the pigtail. Pigtails are meant to be pulled. That's what we're here for. Tell that to Leslie, said Paul. Leslie won't mind, said the pigtail. I promise. I bet, said Paul, just like she didn't mind the last time. You just didn't pull hard enough, said the pigtail. Leslie likes us pulled real hard. Really? Asked Paul. Cross my heart, said the pigtail. The harder, the better. Okay, said Paul, but if you're lying... I promise, said the pigtail. Paul grabbed the left pigtail. It felt good in his hand. He pulled as hard as he could. Yeah! Screamed Leslie. Mrs. Jules asked, Paul, did you pull Leslie's pigtail again? No, said Paul. I pulled the other one. All the children laughed. Are you trying to be funny? Asked Mrs. Jules. No, said Paul. I was trying to be fair. I couldn't pull one and not the other. The children laughed again. Pigtails are meant to be pulled, Paul concluded. Mrs. Jules put a check next to Paul's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. But at last Paul was satisfied. True, his name was on the blackboard with a check next to it, but that really didn't matter. All he had to do was stay out of trouble the rest of the day, and his name would be erased. It's easy to stay out of trouble when you have the best seat in the class. In fact, Paul could do this every day. He could pull Leslie's pigtails twice and then stay out of trouble the rest of the day. There was nothing Leslie could do about it. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Leslie screamed, Yeah! Mrs. Jules circled Paul's name and sent him home early on the kindergarten bus. Nobody would believe that he hadn't pulled Leslie's pigtail again. Chapter 11. Dana. Dana had 4 beautiful eyes. She wore glasses. But her eyes were so beautiful that the glasses only made her prettier. With 2 eyes, she was pretty. With 4 eyes, she was beautiful. With 6 eyes, she would have been more beautiful. And if she had 100 eyes all over her face and her arms and her feet, why, she would have been the most beautiful creature in the world. But poor Dana wasn't covered from head to foot with beautiful eyes. She was covered with mosquito bites. Mrs. Jules picked up her yardstick and said, "Now it's time for arithmetic." "Oh no, Mrs. Jules," said Dana. "I can't do arithmetic. I itch all over. I can't concentrate." And here's a picture of Dana. "But we have all kinds of arithmetic," said Mrs. Jules. "Addition without carrying, addition with carrying, and carrying without addition." "I don't care," cried Dana. "We have that too," said Mrs. Jules. "Addition without carrying. Now stop carrying on." Dana whined. "I can't, Mrs. Jules. I itch too much." "And I'm too thirsty," said DJ. "I'm too tired," said Ron. "I'm too hungry," said Terrence. "I'm too stupid," said Todd. Mrs. Jules hit her desk with her yardstick. Everyone stopped talking. Mrs. Jules said, "We are going to have arithmetic now, and I don't want to hear another thing about it." "But Mrs. Jules, I really do itch. I can't do arithmetic," Dana whined. "No," said Mrs. Jules. "Arithmetic is the best known cure for an itch. How many mosquito bites do you have?" "I don't know," said Dana. "Over 100. First I try scratching one, but then another one starts to itch. So I scratch that one, and that one stops, and another one starts. So I scratch that one, and the itch moves down to another one. Then it goes back to the first one. The itch just never stays in the same place. I just can't scratch them all." "What you need is a good, strong dose of arithmetic," said Mrs. Jules. "I'd rather have calamine lotion," said Dana. "Remember, Dana," said Mrs. Jules, "mosquito bites itch, not numbers." "So what?" said Dana. Mrs. Jules continued, "We'll just have to turn your mosquito bites into numbers." "I'm a mess," Dana moaned. Mrs. Jules began to turn the mosquito bites into numbers. "How much is 3 mosquito bites plus 3 mosquito bites?" she asked. Rondi raised her hand. 6 mosquito bites," she answered. "How much is 6 mosquito bites minus 2 mosquito bites?" asked Mrs. Jules. 4 mosquito bites," said DJ. "How much is 5 mosquito bites times 2? asked Mrs. Jules. 10 mosquito bites," said Bibi. "Very good," said Mrs. Jules. "I still itch," Dana complained. "I've got one more question," said Mrs. Jules. "How much is 49 mosquito bites plus 75 mosquito bites?" Nobody raised a hand. "Think, class," said Mrs. Jules. "This is for Dana." Nobody knew the answer. Dana's itch began to get worse and worse. At last, Dana began counting her own mosquito bites. She counted 75 on one side and 49 on the other. Then she added them together for a total of 124 mosquito bites. 124 mosquito bites," Dana called. "Very good," said Mrs. Jules. Dana had 124 mosquito bites, and none of them itched anymore. "I'm still thirsty," said DJ. "Can arithmetic do anything for that?" "I'm still tired," said Ron. "I'm still hungry," said Terrence. "I'm still stupid," said Todd. "I'm glad we turned my mosquito bites into numbers instead of letters," said Dana. "I could never spell mosquito." Chapter 12. Jason. Jason had a small face and a big mouth. He had the second biggest mouth in Mrs. Jules' class, and there were an awful lot of big mouths in that class. "Mrs. Jules," Jason called without raising his hand, "Joy is chewing gum in class." Joy had the biggest mouth in Mrs. Jules' class, and it was filled with gum. There was hardly even room for her tongue. "Joy, I'm ashamed of you," said Mrs. Jules. "I'm afraid I'll have to put your name up on the board." "That's okay, Mrs. Jules," Jason called. "I'll do it." Jason hopped out of his seat and wrote Joy's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. And here's a picture of Jason. While he was up, Joy took the glob of gum out of her mouth and placed it on Jason's chair. Rondi and Allison giggled. Jason walked back from the blackboard to his desk and sat down. "Mrs. Jules!" he called. "I'm stuck!" Rondi and Allison giggled again. Mrs. Jules got angry. "Joy, you're going home on the kindergarten bus today." "Oh, good," said Todd. "I'll have some company." Todd went home on the kindergarten bus every day. He could never seem to make it to 12 o'clock without getting into trouble 3 times. His name wasn't even up on the blackboard yet, but he knew that by 12 o'clock it would be up, checked, and circled. "Mrs. Jules, what am I going to do? I'm stuck. I'm going to have to stay here the rest of my life," said Jason. "Joy, tell Jason you're sorry," said Mrs. Jules. "I'm sorry, Jason," said Joy. "Oh, that's okay, Joy," said Jason. "I don't mind." "Try to get up, Jason," said Mrs. Jules. Jason tried. "I can't, Mrs. Jules. I'm stuck." Mrs. Jules asked the 3 Erics to help. Eric Fry and Eric Ovens pulled Jason. Eric Bacon held the chair. "Stop!" cried Jason. "You'll rip my pants." Rondi and Allison giggled. "All right," said Mrs. Jules. "Let's try ice water. That should freeze the gum and make it less sticky. I'll go get some from Miss Mush." Miss Mush was the lunch teacher at Wayside School. She had a remarkable ability to undercook a dish and overcook it at the same time. Her specialty was a nice hot bowl of mud. She called it porridge. Jason looked at Ronnie and Allison. "No, Mrs. Jules," he said. "Don't leave me. Besides, Mrs. Mush's ice water is probably warm." "Don't be silly, Jason," said Mrs. Jules. "I'm sure it will be at least as cold as her soups." Rondi and Allison leered at Jason. "No, Mrs. Jules, don't go," begged Jason. I'll be right back, Jason," said Mrs. Jules. She went to Miss Mush for some ice water. As soon as Mrs. Jules stepped out of the door, Ronnie and Allison jumped up from their seats and started to tickle Jason. He laughed until his hair turned purple. The girls got back to their seats just as Mrs. Jules returned. Mrs. Jules carried a big bucket of ice-cold water. "Oh no, please don't! No!" Jason pleaded. "We have no choice," said Mrs. Jules. She threw the water all over him. "Well," said Mrs. Jules, "try to get up." Jason was drenched. "I'm wet, and I'm cold, and I'm still stuck." "Oh, well, it didn't work," said Mrs. Jules. "At least we tried. Now I guess we'll have to cut your pants off." Rondi and Allison giggled. "No, Mrs. Jules, no!" Jason screamed. "I don't mind being stuck here. I'm really very comfortable." "Don't be silly, Jason," said Mrs. Jules. "Don't cut off my pants," said Jason. The three Erics can carry you to the bathroom," said Mrs. Jules. "I'll ask Lois to call your mother. She can bring you a new pair of pants." The 3 Erics took hold of Jason's chair and turned him upside down. "No, Mrs. Jules," said Jason. "Now I'll always have a place to sit down. I won't have to worry about finding a seat on the bus." The 3 Erics began to take him away. "Wait," said Joy. "Mrs. Jules, if I can get Jason unstuck, do I still have to go home on the kindergarten bus?" "All right," said Mrs. Jules. "If you can somehow get Jason free, you don't have to go home early." "Don't trust her, Mrs. Jules," said Jason. He was still hanging upside down. "I'll just kiss him," said Joy. "No!" Jason screamed. "Don't let her kiss me, Mrs. Jules. Throw water on me, tickle me, cut off my pants, hang me upside down from the ceiling, but don't let her kiss me." "I'll just kiss him on the nose," said Joy. "We've got nothing to lose, Jason," said Mrs. Jules. "Ooh, who would want to kiss Jason?" said Allison. Jason hung helplessly upside down. Joy stepped up and kissed him on the nose. Jason fell out of the chair and hit his head on the floor. Rondi and Allison giggled. "Darn," said Todd. "Now I'll have to go home alone again." Joy erased her name from the blackboard. And I'll stop the video there, ending chapter 12. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and as always, I hope to see you next time where we continue the read-along of the Wayside stories from Wayside School, where we will be continuing with Chapter 13. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and please take good care of yourselves.